Like most parents, I wanted my kid to have the best possible life. But it caused me to push this on her way too soon and way too hard and have the effect of turning her off to all things financial. And Jane, my wife, used to say she's absorbing more than she lets on. And I used to say, well, she's not letting that on at all, because it doesn't appear to me that she's absorbing any of it. But that's what inspired me to write those letters that ultimately became the blog, because a friend of mine said, you ought to put this stuff on a blog. And I was just thinking it's a great way to archive the information for her. But now, it turns out she was absorbing it. When she went to college, that was an epiphany for her, because she thought everybody grew up hearing this stuff. And she said, Dad, that's when I suddenly realized how important what you had been telling me really is, because all of my friends were panicking around money and the cost of college and what they were going to do when they got out. And they just had no understanding of this stuff. And so that's kind of what I think turned her philosophically. But so she has been on the simple path. She's in her early 30s now. She just quit her corporate job last fall. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be permanent or like I did, I step away from my corporate jobs periodically for sabbaticals. But, she has, I don't know if she's completely financially independent, but she has what I call FU money, which allows her to make bold decisions like that. I didn't quit my last corporate job in 2011 saying, I want to be an author. I quit my last corporate job in 2011 saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I had no idea what I was going to do next, other than I wanted to get this information down in black and white for my daughter, who I turned off to hearing it, in case by the time she was ready to hear it, I was dead. So the information would still be available to her. And, when a friend of mine read it and said, hey, this is pretty cool, you ought to put it on a blog and share it with your family and friends. I'd heard of blogs before, I'd never seen one, but I thought that's a great way to archive the information.
Welcome to Catching Up to FI, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Jackie, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your host. We're here to help you on your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to FI together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to FI. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Jackie Cummins-Koski, and today we have one of our favorite guests on the show. He leads the pack with regards to the number of times he's been on the show now. And Jackie, what can we say about J.L. Collins, other than he is a friend, and to not just to us, but to the entire community?
Yeah, we're so lucky to have him today. So let me do a proper introduction, because we do have new cohorts of people that may not be as familiar. So let's make sure they are. So our guest today is J.L. Collins. He is referred to affectionately as the Godfather of FI. He's created a worldwide following through his popular blog, J.L. Collins NH, which was originated out of letters he wrote to his daughter, Jessica, which I totally relate, because I did a little book myself dedicating it to my daughter. So I will forever feel that connection.
Who wrote the first letters to her daughter book, you or JL?
I think JL has me, because he started his blog. He was writing his blog. And I just put it in book format. I think it was 2013 that I put it in book format, but he'd been writing his blog for a while. And I would definitely not think that it even rises to the occasion of what he's done. So aside from that, though, Bill, he is the author of 3 books, Pathfinders, which we loved. And we actually interviewed one person that was in that book, and we're about to interview a second one. So it's funny how our paths crossed. His second book is How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable. And then, of course, the iconic The Simple Path to Wealth. With nearly 1 million copies sold across 20 languages, this book has inspired countless readers to rethink their relationship with money and achieve true financial independence. Now, after we've had this global pandemic, 3 presidential administrations, a turbulent stock market, crazy volatility, and this year, the current tariff wars, does the simple path to wealth still work. Well, that's why we brought in J.L. Collins. He joins us again to talk about the updated and expanded version of The Simple Path to Wealth. This new version, it not only updates and reflects the realities of 2025, which has been a little bit crazy, but it also introduces brand new sections like a punch list that distills the book's wisdom into actionable steps, a comprehensive frequently asked questions addressing crypto, meme stocks, and inflation, and an organized resource list to make implementation even easier. So he's making it even more easy for our listeners and for his readers. So JL, it is an honor to have you. Welcome back to Catching Up to FI.
Wow, what a great introduction from both of you. Thank you so much. That's very kind and a great overview of the new edition of the book, Jackie. I don't know what else I can say.
And to me, right out of the bat, is you finished this book around January, right? That was when the last words went to paper. And since that time, we've had quite the interesting economic history or living history. Do you wish you'd have finished the book 4 months later and had all of this other stuff to talk about?
No, because all this other stuff doesn't matter. Jackie touched on the core question that I get a lot, and it kind of makes me chuckle, candidly, but I understand that it comes from a place of fear, and that is whenever something untoward happens, whether it's a pandemic or the turmoil around tariffs, the question comes up is this going to derail the simple path to wealth? Is the simple path to wealth still valid? And I chuckle at that because the simple path to wealth is a strategy that is designed to be implemented for decades. And the idea that some turmoil in the market, and there is always turmoil in the market, it's a perfectly natural part of the process, would derail that, would make it a fairly ineffective path. So no, the simple path to wealth is sound and it continues to work. And it wouldn't have mattered if I'd finished this 4 months later and accounted for the current turmoil, because at some point in the not too distant future, there'll be some other turmoil. It's just the nature of the beast. The trigger that upsets the market is always different, but the process is always the same, which is the market goes into a tizzy for a while, and then it recovers and continues its relentless march up, making those who stay the course wealthier and wealthier.
Yeah, and I have to believe that your book being out for 10 years and having so many people that read through that book with your mantra of, just stay the course, that may have helped a lot of people through these last few months at the beginning of the year, because you were really hitting home that the market will have its ups and downs. You wrote the first book after 2008, which was horrible, probably way worse than it is right now. But I think hopefully when people read that helped them get a really, really good, solid foundation of what to do when they see the market drop. So you may have saved a lot of people from selling.
His meditation certainly did.
Oh, we used that. We used it. JL, we didn't tell you this, but so it was April 2nd was what do they call it? Liberation Day. Okay. That was the day that they supposedly implemented the tariffs. Okay. The day after, which was a Thursday and a Friday, the market dropped like, I could feel my heart dropping, even though I didn't do anything. It didn't feel good. I have emotions, but a lot of people, that's when everybody was just so afraid of what was happening because it was dropping so much so fast. And Bill and we recorded a quick little episode and we had it out by Monday before the market opened. And when we were recording, we're like, we need to include J.L. Collins' meditation. So that was already something you knew that was helpful for people and reminded people to kind of calm your nerves. Emotions are automatic. So it's so hard to not feel something, but you help people understand you don't need to do anything and take a moment with this beautiful meditation that you did to calm your nerves during these markets. So it still is something that is a go-to for a lot of people.
Well, that's great to hear. I recorded that quite a few years ago before COVID. So this would be the second bit of turmoil that meditation has been around for. But yeah, I understand these things are scary, at least for people who are new to all of this. But this is what you do when the market is in turmoil and when the market's dropping is going to determine whether the market makes you wealthy or leaves you bleeding at the side of the road. Because if you panic and sell, you're going to be left bleeding at the side of the road. It's kind of like hurricanes in Florida, right? Very, very scary and dangerous things, especially if you panic and run out in the middle of one. But if you hunker down and wait it out, probably not going to be a problem, and the sun comes out again. And if you're going to live in Florida, you should expect these things. These are perfectly natural occurrences. And turmoil in the market, whether it's a 10% correction or a 20% bear market or something more serious, these are perfectly natural parts of the process. The triggers are always different. They always, especially if it's a crash, they always, like at COVID. I remember people telling me, JL, we get it that you're supposed to stay the course, but this time, surely the simple path isn't going to work anymore. People are dying. Economies all around the world are shutting down completely. And my response to that was, no, this is not different this time. The trigger is different. The trigger is unique. It's tragic that people are dying. We haven't had a pandemic like this in 100 years. But that's the only thing that's different. How the market will react is going to be exactly the same. And in fact, if anything that was different in COVID is how quickly the market recovered after that particular drop. So right now, as we're recording this, the markets have pretty much recovered from the turmoil around that April 2nd announcement. One of the tragedies, by the way, is I had a comment on my blog from a woman who, in the midst of when it was down pretty much the worst, which is not, I think it went down at 1.19%. So very close to that, she sold. And she commented on the blog, she said, I learned that I just can't take this. I understand that I should be able to, but I can't. And so I sold, and I've just decided equities are not for me. That's a perfectly valid position to take. As the philosophers say, know thyself. The tragedy here is that she didn't go through that process of understanding that about herself when times were good. So right now, the market is recovered. If this has terrified you, what's happened in the last couple of months, the market's just giving you an opportunity, at least as we're recording this today, to change your allocation or maybe change your approach and with little or no damage, which it rarely does. But if you're not going to stay the course through these expected turmoils, then you should not be following the simple path to wealth, and you should not be investing in equities at all. And there are other options you can pursue. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to do this, it's essential you not panic and sell.
Yeah, I mean, my mother is a perfect example. She realized that she couldn't be in equities, and she managed to retire at 70, but she is an individual bond portfolio. She's done quite well being frugal in individual bonds and not needing to be in equities. And I think she's seen her portfolio double. The doubling time was longer, but being frugal and being in individual bonds works for her.
Right.
And she can sleep at night, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that's a good point, JL, that based on what's happened the last few months, and it tested a lot of people. So maybe have a little reflection about how you felt, what you did, and is there anything else you feel like you need to do based on your risk tolerance in a bad market?
Well, we haven't seen a long bad market in a long time. So these have been testing the waters. I mean, tariffs is one thing. And I want to hear this is the shock this time, tariffs. I haven't seen that one before. Do you have any particular take on this sort of schizophrenic tariff war?
Well, for what it's worth, I personally think that tariffs are a terrible and a dangerous idea. I can see the case for renegotiating some of our trade agreements with a variety of countries, maybe a lot of countries. I think it would be better approached in a different fashion. So, I mean, I can appreciate that goal, and there could be an advantage to that. But I think sweeping tariffs are a dangerous and bad idea. Now, one of the things I've learned, and I actually did a post about this recently, one of the things I've learned 50 years of investing is how often I can be wrong. So who knows? I mean, maybe these tariffs will turn out to be a wonderful idea. Maybe they'll turn out to be every bit as glorious as the president says they're going to be.
Yeah.
What was interesting for me was it wasn't so much the tariffs as it was the uncertainty and the trust. Because the market didn't change one day to the next. But the announcement of the tariffs did. And it was amazing to see these dramatic fluctuations, which I hadn't seen. I mean, since I woke up, other than COVID, I haven't seen such dramatic fluctuations in the market because I was pretty much agnostic and head in the sand when the Great Recession occurred. And I sold at the bottom. I was completely oblivious as to what was going on. The Simple Path to Wealth hadn't come out and I needed it. But yeah, that's okay. It's okay. Late starters, it's a common story. But these little shocks, and these are more little shocks, we talk about them, but it's sort of, as you said, test the waters to see if we can stay the course.
Yeah, I think it's instructive maybe to look at a worse time because these have been very short. I mean, who knows what this is going to lead to? That's still an open book. But looking at something like COVID, it was remarkably short term. But if you go back to the 08-09 financial debacle, and even before that, if you go a decade earlier to the tech crash of 2000. So if you look at that tech crash, the market went down, I want to say 49%. And then in 08-09, I think it got down as low as negative 56%. And between those two crashes that bookended that decade, you had kind of a lost decade. The market over that 10 years returned something, I mean, surprisingly, not as bad as you might think, but it was down like 0.63% a year on average. So kind of a negative return. And I think most people would look at that and say, wow, that's a terrible time to be an investor. And if I'd known that, I would have gotten out. But the truth is, if you were following the Simple Path to Wealth, which says you stay the course through thick and thin, you would have spent a decade accumulating shares at bargain prices.
Right.
And then, of course, after 09, the market has, by and large, had an incredible run for the last 15 years. And those shares that you acquired from 2000 to 2009 at remarkably low prices would be paying huge returns to you now. So if you're in the wealth accumulation stage, a market crash or an extended down market is an absolute gift as long as you stay the course. Now, if you're living on your portfolio, it can be a little tougher. But if you've added bonds to your portfolio in that phase, as the Simple Path calls for, well, now you adjust your allocation. And that's how you take advantage of these downturns. Because in the downturn, the percent that you own in stocks is going to drop because the value of your stocks is dropping. The relative value of the bond portion is going to rise. So you sell some of those bond shares to pick up some of those cheap stock shares to bring it back into whether it's 80-20 or 70-30 or 60-40 or whatever your preferred allocation is. So if you're on the Simple Path, as long as you stay the course and follow your discipline, if anything, market declines work to your advantage.
Yeah, and I would say, JL, I'm definitely a living example. So I retired about 6 years ago in 2019, but I started most of my heavy lifting in terms of investing in 2008. And I was around smarter people than me telling me to stay the course. Again, the Simple Path to Wealth wasn't quite out there, but I started reading your blog shortly after that. And I can firmly say that I would have never reached financial independence and retired early if I didn't have the help of the stock market and I wasn't shoving as much money into the market as I possibly could through 2008, 2009, and the 10 years that followed that. So it made all the difference because a lot of people will say, well, you just started at the right time. And I'm like, I didn't know it at the time, but yeah, that helped a lot. So yeah, I guess when I see the market drop now, COVID, and then what happened this year, I think about 2008. And it makes me realize like how important it is to see the market, see it as an opportunity. And I'm hoping that so many people in our community that might have been in the Facebook group, all these people sharing, stay the course, you sharing in your book, stay the course. That is the key. And I have to believe that we've had some impact on people when it comes to that. But it's been a decade, right? And I think it really does prove that simplicity, people are very attracted to that. That shows in how successful the book has been.
Well, you struck a chord because you wrote this for your daughter, started as letters, turned into a book, and now it's been 10 years. How's your daughter's portfolio? Did she read the book?
Yeah.
And she's been involved in this book. I mean, how is her simple path? Because this is all about her, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is all about her. To back up the story, I think that getting money right can make your life so much better. And if you don't get money right, your life can be so much harder. So, like most parents, I wanted my kid to have the best possible life. But it caused me to push this on her way too soon and way too hard and have the effect of turning her off to all things financial. And Jane, my wife, used to say she's absorbing more than she lets on. And I used to say, well, she's not letting that on at all because it doesn't appear to me that she's absorbing any of it. But that's what inspired me to write those letters that ultimately became the blog, because a friend of mine said, you ought to put this stuff on a blog. And I was just thinking it's a great way to archive the information for her. But now, it turns out she was absorbing it. When she went to college, that was an epiphany for her because she thought everybody grew up hearing this stuff. And she said, Dad, that's when I suddenly realized how important what you had been telling me really is, because all of my friends were panicking around money and the cost of college and what they were going to do when they got out. And they just had no understanding of this stuff. And so that's kind of what I think turned her philosophically. But so she has been on the simple path. She's in her early 30s now. She just quit her corporate job last fall. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be permanent or like I did, I step away from my corporate jobs periodically for sabbaticals. But, she has, I don't know if she's completely financially independent, but she has what I call FU money, which allows her to make bold decisions like that. So I knew that she had been following the simple path, but the simple path is designed to be easy to follow. You don't really need to have a great depth of understanding of investing to follow the simple path. You have to understand a couple of basic concepts, implement a couple of strategies, set them up on autopilot, and then you're done. And that's kind of what I thought she'd done. But when we started working on the revision of the book together, I suddenly realized how deeply she actually understood this stuff in a way that I didn't know, and which was, of course, enormously gratifying. And she likes to tease me today. She says, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no blog. There would have been no Chautauquas. There'd be no books. And Bill and Jackie wouldn't want to interview you.
That's right. Well, so I have a quick question about your daughter. When you were saying you tried to push it on her too early, because I think I was guilty of that, and lecture daddy over here was definitely guilty of that. But how old was she when you were trying to teach her this stuff? Like, was she in the high chair and trying to eat her baby food, or like, how young was she?
I think she's probably in the womb.
Oh,
Okay, DTSAX.
right. They say they learn through osmosis when they're in the belly.
Right. Some people play music, Here we have the Wall Street Journal,
Yeah.
So, no, I think maybe when she was as young as 4, maybe 5.
Wow.
Yeah, we have a picture of us sitting together where I'm on the couch reading the newspaper, and she's sitting next to me, holding up a section of the newspaper, which is upside down, looking like she's reading it.
That's pretty early.
It's incredible that you've done that. Now you're doing it for generations, because my nieces are graduating from high school and moving on to college. And their graduation present this year in the next couple of weeks is the book Fire for Dummies and the book Simple Path to Wealth. Those are the 2 books. And then they get a $50 bill that says, if you do this, $50 a week for the rest of your life, you'll be a millionaire. And you are my future millionaire. And Jackie said, you're going to set the world on fire. So, I mean, these are things that get handed down now, not just to your daughter, but our daughters, our sons, our nieces. And that must be really gratifying.
Oh, it really is. And what a huge advantage for these kids to start so early, because this is a long-term game. As I said, this is a strategy you implement for decades, and that gives you the power of compounding, which is just tremendous growth potential. So I mean, I spent decades wandering in the wilderness figuring this stuff out. What an advantage to our kids that are, assuming they're smart enough to embrace it and not feel like they have to go out and make the same mistakes we made. But what an advantage it is for my daughter and, for your kids. And it's just, it's kind of amazing to see.
Yeah. So I have a question around your sort of late started. So what was your career? Because I only know you as J.L. Collins, the Godfather of FI, but you did something before you started writing that blog, right? And I guess
Right.
what was your career? When did you step away from that and then started doing the blog? And it may have crossed over a little bit.
Yeah, so I was in the magazine publishing business, in business to business magazines, trade magazines.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, that's where I spent my career. And I started saving and investing pretty much as soon as I got my first professional job. I came out of college in the 70s, and it was the age of stagflation. It was really a very, very bad economy. So it took me 2 years to get that first professional job. And it just happened to be in the magazine business, and that sort of set the course. And for the most part, I liked it quite a bit. I've often said I liked working. I just didn't like to have to do it all the time. And so by accumulating what I thought of, I had no concept. In fact, it wasn't until after I started the blog that I'd even heard the concept of FI. That just wasn't a thing. I had come across the concept of having FU money in a novel by James Clavell back in the 70s, and I thought, that's what I want. And FU money is just enough money to make bold decisions, to be able to tell someone FU if you need to and move on. And so as I accumulated that money, I was able to step away from jobs for periods of time, which nobody else in my world was doing. Whether their job was going well or not going well, they just continually had to grind it out because they didn't have that financial cushion that I had. But if I got bored or got a boss I didn't care for or just felt like, I want to travel for a while, I could do that.
Well, and your daughter's doing it now too. She's got that concept down. She learned it from you.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, or she may just be fully retired. That remains to be seen. What
Oh.
back corporately, who knows?
Oh, so she doesn't talk to you about her money, huh?
Well, we talk about it. Yeah, absolutely. We talk about it. But I think right now she got tired of the corporate stuff. She was very successful at it, made good money. But she's very into nutrition and physical fitness. And so she teaches several classes at, I think, 3 different gyms in the Savannah area. And she loves, weight training and kickboxing and Zumba and those kinds of classes. And they don't pay a lot of money, but they pay enough for the day-to-day kinds of stuff, and then the portfolio supports the rest.
There you go. She is your daughter.
She's created her own shadow, because living in the shadow of J.L. Collins, if you don't get it right, that's a lot of pressure.
I don't know that she ever felt that way. Years ago, I think she was still in college. We were out in California, the 3 of us, and I had been invited to give a talk at DreamWorks. And so we go over to DreamWorks, and DreamWorks, of course, had made a lot of the movies that she grew up with, loving as a kid. So very nice people, and they gave us a little tour of the place, and we had lunch at the cafeteria. And then there was a handful of employees of DreamWorks that were fans of my work. And I want to say maybe 30 people gathered in a conference room afterwards, and we were doing a little Q&A, and Jane and Jessica and I are sitting up on the dais in front of this group. And of course, most of the questions are coming to me, but one woman turns to Jessica and she says something along the lines of, "Jessica, it must have been wonderful growing up with this man as your father." And Jessica sat back in her chair, and she looked at me, and she looked back at this woman, and she looked at me again, and she said, "Not as much as you think."
I think all kids say that about their parents. They appreciate you in hindsight, but that's really cool.
Right,
She was on the stage with you. And I mean, that, we need to have the podcast with you, your wife, and Jessica all on at the same time and have a generational approach to this. That one may not have been done that often. So let's put a pin in that for the future, Jackie.
Yeah, I think we definitely should. And this is so fascinating, JL. I didn't know a lot of these things about you. I didn't know you were in the magazine business, but you said you kind of started your career in the 70s. So to me, what's fascinating is most people that grew up in the 70s, they stayed at companies for 30 years and they were getting a pension. But for you, that wasn't the case. And because I was always curious, like, well, didn't he have a pension like everybody else? Why is he worried about the stock market? But you were investing in a 401k, it sounds like, and not depending on a pension and staying with one company for 30 years?
Yeah, I think actually the whole pension thing was even the generation before mine. The way I've looked at it is the generation before mine. Pensions were not a thing for very long. I think people that are aware of them at all aware that they kind of went away, and I think there's some people who feel cheated by that. But pensions only lasted for about a generation. Because the idea that a company could pay all of its ex-employees a fixed amount of money until they died was just not a sustainable business model. And so it only lasted for a generation. I want to say it probably started maybe in the 30s or 40s. And then by the 70s, that was pretty much over. But in the generation prior to mine, I'm a baby boomer, and I'm not even sure what the older, I think that was the greatest generation, the World War II generation. I think those were the days that if you were fortunate, you went to work for a company and you stayed at that company for 30 years or whatever it was. And you, at age 65, you got a gold watch and a pension and you went on your way. For my generation, and if I'm an example of it, I stayed in one industry. I stayed in business-to-business magazines, but I worked for a variety of different companies. I went from job to job whenever somebody candidly would pay me more money or offer me a better position. So job hopping was sort of the key to success in my generation, or the way I thought about it. But still in the same industry. It was very difficult to change industries. And I think nowadays, not only do people not stay in one job for 30 years, I don't even think they stay in one industry for 30 years. They're a lot more mobile and flexible. And I think that's very cool. I think that's very exciting. I would not have wanted to work for one company for 30 years. That sounds awful to me. But it would have been fun to try a couple of different industries in my career. But that just was not an option on the table. So I think there's a lot more flexibility around. But yeah, pensions are gone, but they were really only here for maybe one generation.
Well, the only constant in life is change.
Right.
And the other constant in life might be the simple path to wealth, because we need to know what has changed, what changed in the book for you that you needed to update at this 10-year mark. What did you find was different, and what did you find was the same?
Well, before I get into that, let me focus a little bit on your comment about what lasts, right?
Yeah.
So why do I think the simple path to wealth is something that will survive for decades and be effective? And it's because it kind of aligns with human nature as our economy does, right? We live in a capitalist economy, which means that individuals can own property. You can own a house, you can own a car, you can own a business. And because we have a stock market, you can own shares in companies. You can be an owner. That's what allows a simple path to work. And if you're invested at broad-based, low-cost index funds, as I recommend, VTSAX is the fund I personally invest in. It's a total stock market index fund. That means that there are about 3,600, roughly. This changes as companies go out of business or drop off the exchanges and new companies are created. But there's about 3,600 publicly traded companies in the United States. And with VTSAX, I own a small portion of every one of them. And everybody in those companies, from the factory floor to the CEO, is working to make me richer. Now, some of them will succeed, and some won't. The ones that don't fade away and they go off the index. The ones that succeed become a larger and larger part of the index, because the index is cap weighted, which simply means that the bigger and more successful the company, the bigger a percentage of that company the index owns. So as long as that dynamic of people striving to create products and services, that human drive of creativity exists, and I don't see that going away anymore, and as long as we have an economic system that allows individuals like us to own a piece of that, then the simple path to wealth is going to apply for the foreseeable future through thick and thin.
What's interesting to me is you've stuck with VTSAX and not moved to, say, VTI. Why did the simple path to wealth not become a VTI and chill, where ETFs are now the thing? Why did you stick with a mutual fund?
Because I'm an old guy and that's what I started with, you know? That's a great question. So first of all, VTI, as you alluded to, is the ETF, exchange traded fund, ETF version of the mutual fund, which is VTSAX. So VTI owns exactly the same portfolio. So for anybody who owns VTI, and I get this question all the time, can I own VTI? Of course you can own VTI. It's exactly the same portfolio. And as it happens, the expense ratio is slightly less. I think VTSAX is 0.04 and is 0.03 for VTI. So if I were to do it over today, I would probably use VTI just for that reason. I don't think it's worth necessarily making the change. Well, maybe someday I'll make the change, but anyway, you can, I mean, they're the equivalent. So whichever is most comfortable for the investor, it's fine with me. And by the way, I'll go further and say these are an ETF and a fund that are a part of the Vanguard group, that are Vanguards. But there are other investment companies besides Vanguard, like Fidelity, and these days they all have their own version of a total stock market index fund or a total stock market ETF. And one step further, a question I get a lot is, well, what about an S&P 500 fund, which is an index that tracks just the 500 largest publicly traded companies? That's all my 401k offers, for instance. They don't have a total stock market fund. You know, is that okay? Absolutely, that's okay. That's the fund that was the fund that Jack Bogle first created in 1975 when he created the first index fund available to individuals. That's the fund he owned himself until his death. That's the fund I think Warren Buffett recommends to his heirs. So yeah, an S&P 500 fund, it's just as good. If you look at the performance, they track almost identically. So then the question becomes, why do I prefer the total stock market? Just because it gives me a little bit of small cap, a little bit of mid cap, and it's kind of the same reason I add Tabasco to my eggs. I like that little extra kick, but the eggs are still the eggs.
Yeah. So Jael, since Bill was asking you about, why didn't you change the fund in this new version? I'm just curious about like your team and other, how did you even decide what pieces you felt like needed to be updated? Talk about your team a little bit and how you picked what things to even update in the first place. And Jessica was part of that team too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Jessica turned out to be a big part of it. And that was probably the most gratifying part of this process for me personally, was getting a chance to work with her, because that was a lot of fun, but also seeing how deeply she'd come to understand and embrace this stuff. So the new version of The Simple Path to Wealth has a publisher now, Authors Equity. And the original I self-published. So now my daughter likes to tease me. She says, Dad, you have people now.
Now you're a big deal, right?
You have people now. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll have my people call your people.
Well, that actually is a difference, because we had to talk to your people to get to you to do this show today. Before it was a direct link. Now we're talking to your people at the publisher. So that's interesting. You're right.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't have to deal with you anymore.
But, you just got to show up, Yeah. That's it.
But to answer your question as to how we chose what to change and what to add, Madeline, who is the president of this new publishing, it's a new company that just started. I think they're just barely a year old. I think maybe March of last year.
I wondered, because I didn't recognize the name. Okay.
Yeah, they were James Clear, who did Atomic Habits, who is very instrumental in recruiting me to this publisher. Madeline was his publisher she was the president of, I'm drawing a blank, but one of the big publishing companies where he had published Atomic Habits. And like most new authors with publishers, the deals they get initially are not very good. And of course, Atomic Habits was a huge, huge success.
Yeah.
And he's working on a second book and, of course, was looking for a much, much better deal as a now established author. And when he was negotiating that with the original publisher, and Madeline in particular, as I understand it, she was like, I understand what you're asking for, and I understand why it's a reasonable thing to do, but, we're a large publishing company, and we're just not structured. We're not able to accommodate that. And evidently out of that conversation became the idea of launching a new, smaller, more nimble publishing company that was.
Well, the name of this publishing company is Authors Equity, which really speaks to what it is about. Can you tell us about what Authors Equity does that's different from other publishers?
Well, so first of all, it's been a real pleasure to work with them. They are just a really great team, and they have different people doing different things. Madeline, and we're kind of getting away from the original question, but let me go back to that. Just Madeline, who worked with me directly, and again, this is a woman who used to be the CEO of one of the major publishing companies, and now she's functioning as an editor for me. But that's the nature of a small company, right? And so a lot of the new material were ideas that she came up with. And she said, we think we ought to add the Toolkit and the FAQ and the sort of things you touched on in the introduction, Jackie. We certainly knew we wanted to update all of the numbers throughout the Simple Path. We also knew that none of the philosophy and the basic approach was going to change because that's core. So anyway, she was instrumental in guiding some of that. And obviously, I had veto power on anything and everything as we went along, although I didn't feel the need to do that very often because the ideas were just so good. And a lot of the ideas, by the way, came up when we were discussing whether or not I was going to come on board at all. And because I liked the dynamic of the ideas is one of the reasons I came on board. But going back now, Bill, to your question and your observation about the name of the Authors Equity, from a financial point of view, the publisher takes a much smaller percentage of the revenue that the book generates than a traditional publisher does. And I think that's the thing that James Clear was looking for with his new deal. So
yeah, I learned that too as well, because I Fire for Dummies was with a traditional publisher, and I'm definitely not as well known as you guys. So, that aside, you get like peanuts. Like it takes you, depending on how many you sell, but if you get an advance, that I explain to everyone, that's just a loan and you pay back in the form of book royalties. And it could take years for some people to recoup that. And then, so you don't make a penny, you don't get a penny in your pocket until you pay back that advance. And so, yeah, it's a little bit disheartening how little the author actually gets. So I absolutely love this concept of Authors Equity.
yeah, they're very selective in who they go after because they're small. They have a pretty limited bandwidth. So
that leaves me out then.
They were, you got a successful book on your hand. Once you get the first one's the hard one, right?
Yeah, it was tough. Yeah.
And then after that, you become a much more marketable commodity because most books are not successful. I remember when I was getting ready to publish the original Simple Path to Wealth back in 2016. I spent 3 years writing it, kind of finished the manuscript in 2015, and then 2016, I was doing, because I was self-publishing, all the laborious work of actually getting it as a finished product. And as I was coming near that, I thought, I have no idea even what success would look like. So I started asking around and with people in the business, and what I heard pretty consistently was the vast majority of books never sell 1,000 copies.
Right.
And so if you sell more than 1,000 copies, you are in the rare minority. If you sell 5,000 copies, you've hit it out of the ballpark. And if you sell 10,000 copies, that's a bona fide runaway success. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, given the size of my blog readership, I think I might be able to hit 10,000 copies. And if I'm able to hit 10,000 copies, given the number of hours I spent writing this thing, I will be slightly worse off than if I'd worked at McDonald's. But at least it'll get me close.
Well, now we're talking 1 million copies later. That is a worldwide impact. 20 different languages, 1 million copies. And we're celebrating 1 million because about the time that this episode airs, celebrating your work, your book, your legacy, we'll have reached about 1 million downloads. So it's 1 million for 1 million, JL.
That's amazing. And if you're like me, it's probably stunning to you. I mean, I still can't wrap my head around the fact that the book has been so well received over the last decade. And I imagine you feel the same about the podcast.
Yeah, it's incredible what just a little idea, a message to your daughter can turn into. You know, your whole second career. You're a late starter, as Jackie has said, and you have had a renaissance second career here that probably fully eclipses your prior professional career.
Yeah, certainly the most satisfying work I've ever done. But the other thing is, but it was not something it was not a goal. I didn't quit my last corporate job in 2011 saying, I want to be an author. I quit my last corporate job in 2011 saying, I don't want to do this anymore. And I had no idea what I was going to do next, other than I wanted to get this information down in black and white for my daughter, who I turned off to hearing it, in case by the time she was ready to hear it, I was dead. So the information would still be available to her. And, you know, when a friend of mine read it and said, hey, this is pretty cool, you ought to put it on a blog and share it with your family and friends. I'd heard of blogs before. I'd never seen one, but I thought that's a great way to archive the information. I don't have to worry about all these pieces of paper getting lost. And so at his suggestion, I figured out how to do the blog. I remember one of my early readers, because I picked a design that I thought looked cool, and feedback from one of the early readers was, you know, I really like your content, but your design makes my eyes bleed. Well, okay, I got that part wrong.
Well, it goes to show you that content can be the heavy hitter and hit it out of the park, where design, it can matter. Like the cover of your book, that design was important, because when I think of The Simple Path to Wealth, I see that picture. So whoever did that for you, it did make a big difference.
That was, the illustration was done by a really good friend of mine, a woman I met when I was riding my bicycle around Ireland in the 70s by the name of Trish. And she's an amazing artist. And so she did that illustration for me. And of course, we used it again on the new edition because everybody loves it.
Oh, I was just about to ask that.
And the content that comes out is really, it's changed, because now we have an album. We have a FI album. The Donegans have heralded you also in their album with The Simple Path. They heralded Bill Bengen with the 4% rule. And Bill Bengen is coming out with a new book.
I saw that.
He's tilling the soil again, too, because his information has updated. And it's now the 4.7% rule instead of maybe the 4% rule. We can spend more in retirement. We can retire earlier, which is great news for people. Blend your book with Bill Bengen's book, and you've got a very robust financial life.
You know, the thing about Bengen's 4%, and my understanding is, I don't know him personally, but my understanding is that he has always said from way back when, and I think he created that in like 1990 or something. It's a long time now.
Yeah.
He's always said that 4% was very conservative, designed to last through really bad periods of time. And of course, in recent years, there's been all this angst about, oh, is 4% too much? Should it be 3.8% or 3.69270%? And it's like what theologians 400 years ago used to debate how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. I mean, it's just 4%'s a very conservative guideline. And then I think if he's coming out, and I didn't know he was now recommending 4.7, but if anything, that's an illustration of just how conservative the original 4% really is, and by extension, how safe it is.
Well, we've got to get you to meet him. We've got to have them both on.
Yeah,
Jack.
time to do a little matchmaking.
Yeah, we got to do Bill Bengen and J.L. Collins so that the icons of this industry can actually have a cup of coffee together.
Yeah, I would love it. I think the concept of financial independence, or at least that there's a mathematical formula that can identify when you've arrived, namely the 4%. That's a big deal. That's a watermark. And yeah, I would love to. I'd love to meet him.
Well, say no more. We will hook you up for sure because we see a lot of similarities. And of course, both of you are well respected. And like Bill said, following what you say and what Bill Bengen says, you just cannot go wrong. So I appreciated hearing your late starter story. So about how old were you when you started doing the blog? Because I really want to, for our other late starters that's listening, to say, man, we still got a lot more years. Even when you think you're late, how old were you when you started that blog and started on this new adventure?
Yeah, so I started it in the spring of 2011. So that's when and again, remember, I was not, in my mind, starting some new venture. I was just putting this stuff down for my daughter. But I would have been 60 in the spring.
No.
I turned 61 and my birthday's in November. So later in 2011, I turned 61. Right.
Wow.
So, yeah. And it's been enormously gratifying the way it's evolved. And I also, when I quit my corporate job, I made the classic mistake that anybody who talks about how people should think about their retirement says, that make sure that before you retire, you know what you're retiring to. You know what you're going to do. I had no idea. I mean, I was just jotting these letters down was not going to take a whole lot of time, right? And in fact, the stock series, which is famous on my blog, I only intended that to be the first 5 posts. That's what I had in mind. And now it's up to like 35. And that's mainly because of the feedback I get from readers who would ask about different things. And I'd say, yeah, I should write about that. And so my readers have really kind of guided the work since I got this very basic stuff down and out in the world. But yeah, I never intended this to be some second career, but here we are. And, I'm a very, very fortunate guy. Fortunate that I've enjoyed doing it and that people have responded so well to it.
Well, we agree. And I have to make one little ding here because I always come back to it and Jackie, gives me a hard time for it. But with way things have changed and VTSAX, with the American stock market has been the bear or the bull in the market. But internationally, things have changed this year. And I have to ask you, because we talked about this last time, and you said, well, we'll see where we stand a decade from now. Do you think we're reverting to the mean now and that international is going to come back to the forefront and be a diversifier for us since it's done so well, whereas the U.S. stock market has not in the first quarter of this year?
Yeah, so the first quarter of this year, you may know the numbers better than I do, but I think the U.S. market was down like 6%, and Europe and Asia were up 12 to 15%. So that's a big swing when you add that 6% to the 12 or 15. So yeah, international is certainly beating the U.S. market this year.
So do you feel differently about a total world index fund now?
No.
See, you saw Bill trying to reel you in there, JL, right?
Shot down again.
Well, but to be clear, I don't now, and I didn't back then feel negative about a total world fund. So let's talk about it a little bit, because this is not the first time that international markets have outperformed the U.S. market. I want to say, I think in the 80s, for a decade, international outperformed U.S. So I've never been a proponent of only investing in the U.S. market because it was always going to outperform the rest of the world, because it doesn't. I mean, these things go in cycles. And we don't know sitting here today if this is a fluke for these first few months and the U.S. is going to dominate again, or if this is the beginning of another decade of dominance for international. But that's not what drives my thinking about the U.S. My thinking is more that the U.S. is still the most dominant economy in the world. We account for something along the order of 60% of all publicly traded companies in the world. If you invest in the U.S. market with a total market index fund or an S&P 500 fund, you are investing in companies that are primarily international companies. So as the rest of the world grows and prospers, those companies will grow and prosper along with it. So you get to go along on that ride. You're investing in the market that has the most secure and transparent markets available anywhere in the world. And it's also the least expensive to invest in as an American. To be clear, if you are anywhere else in the world, your market is not going to be large enough to allow you to get away with only investing in Canada or Australia or England or France or Germany or Japan or China. So this option is you should definitely be in a world fund if you're anywhere else in the world. And I do see at some point, as the rest of the world continues to grow and prosper, even as the U.S. grows and prospers along with it, maybe that portion we represent will begin to be a smaller part of an ever-growing pie. So at some point, you might want to go to a world fund. And for those people who say, I think that point's now, like you don't get big pushback from me. I'm okay with that. I don't particularly feel the need now. I talked to my daughter about this. I think the U.S. is going to be dominant probably for the rest of my life, but at my age, that's not that long a time period. For my daughter, who's looking at investing the next 50, 60 years, then I tell her, pay attention. There might come a time, there probably will come a time where a world fund will make more sense than it does now.
Oh, I had to ask. Just for Jackie. I have to say, too, I have been swayed a little bit, and I have to, in full disclosure to our audience, I have stepped back a little bit from the total world, where I've tilted a little. I still am an international fan, but I've tilted more towards the U.S., and I'm about 20% international as opposed to the 40 that I might have been before. So I finally gave up on it. I saw the light. Jackie and you and all the influences in my life said, okay, and you're supposed to stay the course, and I have succumbed to a change in strategy.
Just when the rest of the world is beginning to dominate.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I am so proud of you, Bill Yount. You made that change because I was about to say JL is very convincing and logical, and I was going to ask you, Bill, if you have changed anything over the last since you thought that finally international's coming back, and it's been a decade almost, and
I didn't give up on it, but I just decided to have a little
back.
home country bias.
You did.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So we have another question. We asked our audience a little bit, JL, what questions that they had. And we actually got something on SpeakPipe. And if you're a listener, if you're in the Facebook group, we allow you to go to SpeakPipe. It's on our website, and you can leave a voicemail question. So I'm going to play that, JL. Okay. And we would love to hear what you think. So let's see if we can get this work.
All right.
Hi, Jim. I am so excited that you updated your book. My question would be, if I want a more conservative portfolio during my drawdown phase as I'm in FIRE, do I adjust my profile now while the stock market's down, or do I wait for the market to recover some and then make my portfolio more conservative? For example, I'd like to go to 70-30 ratio of stocks to bonds versus the 80-20 that I have right now. In addition, what kind of drawdown strategies for variable spending would you institute during a market correction and bear market, and possibly the worst case scenario, stagflation, would you suggest? Thank you so much, Jim. You're such a valuable person to so many people in this community.
Okay. Well, just for correction, you go by JL. You're not Jim, but a lot of us assume that it's Jim. So what do you say to this caller?
Yeah, it sounds like she's asking Jim Collins, the guy who wrote Good to Great,
right,
the other author of this question. And I have no idea what Jim Collins would say, but what J.L. Collins would say is, to answer the first part of the question, it depends on how much runway she has, and she doesn't say if she's at that retirement stage at living on the portfolio like right now, or if she's looking out, say, 5 years and she sees it coming. So if you've got a little bit of runway, like 5 years, then I would say just begin to make the transition gradually. If you're looking at it right now and you want to go from, I think she said 80-20 to 70-30, then pull the trigger right now, because nobody knows where the market goes from here. It's been very volatile. Right now, as we are recording this, I don't know when you're going to release it, but we're recording it on May 5th. The market has recovered most of its losses, so it's back to about even. So this would be a good time if that was your concern. Maybe by the time this releases, it will be up considerably or down considerably. And whatever it is, you don't know where it's going to go from there. So if you were to wait, you would be assuming that it is going to go back up at that point. Or rather, if you're waiting, you're assuming it's going to be going down at that point, in which case waiting will pay off because you'll be able to make that transition at lower prices. But it might not do that. So because we just don't know, and even if you're looking, whatever your political persuasions are, you might be looking at it saying, I absolutely know it's going to recover because I have great faith in these policies, or I absolutely know it's going to get worse because I have no faith in these policies. Well, yeah, but you really don't know that because the market doesn't care what you believe. The market's going to do whatever the market's going to do. And because we don't know that, I would say make the change when you want or need to make the change. The second part of her question is withdrawal strategies. If you go into retirement and you're following the simple path to wealth, you're going to have a large slug of equities in an S&P 500 or a total stock market index fund. You definitely want to have it at least 50% in equities because that's the growth engine that will allow your portfolio to survive over time. And then you want to have some fixed income like bonds and cash, say, in a money market. And the reason you do that is when the market goes down, that gives you an opportunity to rebalance and pick up shares that are now at a bargain price. But it also provides that dry powder that you can begin to draw on. So if you don't want to sell your equities when they're down, you can draw on your money market fund to pay your immediate expenses or tap into your bond fund to do the same. But the most fundamental thing you should do when you enter this phase of living on the portfolio, before you're doing that, when you're building your wealth, you should be having your dividends and interest, if you own bonds, reinvested into the fund to buy more shares. But when you're living on the portfolio, you're going to want to have those dividends sent to your checking account as cash to live on. You're going to have that interest sent to your checking account. So if you're in, say, VTSAX with your stocks and VBTLX, which is Vanguard's total bond market fund for your bonds, VTSAX is paying, I think, 1.3% in dividends, and VBTLX is like 3.5%, let's say. So if you're pulling from that, you're going to have, and you're targeting a 4% withdrawal rate, you're going to probably come up with about 2.5% of that 4% between those two things. So that leaves you an extra 1.5%. And to get there, that's where you're going to be selling shares, either selling some of your money market, your bond, or your stock. That's an important thing to understand because when the market goes down dramatically, people get so upset and they say, wow, the market's down 20%. And if I sell the stock to live on, then I'm going to lose 20%. No, because you're not going to be selling your whole portfolio to live on. You're going to be selling maybe 1.5%, right? And the market always recovers. So even if you have to sell that 1.5% when your share price is down, that's not a terrible, terrible thing. So that's how I think about withdrawal.
Yeah. So great point. And we get questions like that all the time. So I think you've helped a lot of people. And there you go. Our caller just got her question answered by the J.L. Collins. And what I love about the new version of the book is that you have an entire section of frequently asked questions just like this. There was a question about international that Bill asked, and, things about allocation. There is even a question, Bill, I don't know if you remember, but there was a question about late starters. It's like, is this investing game just for young people? And we know the answer to that, right, JL?
We do. Did you want to hear it?
Let's hit it. Let's hit it.
So in your introduction, you mentioned my book, Pathfinders. And Pathfinders is a collection of stories from people all over the world and at all different stages of their investing life who have read The Simple Path to Wealth and embraced the process, and they're describing their success with it. And I wrote The Simple Path to Wealth for my daughter, who was in college at the time, at the very beginning of her adult life. And so there is that kind of bias, if you will, in the book for young people. It probably feels like a book that's written for young people. Also feels like a book that was written for Americans, because she's an American and I'm an American, and that these are the markets I know. So it's striking to me that people from all over the world, different nationalities, different ages, different stages of life, have found the principles so valuable. And I think one of the reasons is that no matter when you start, if you have an aggressive savings rate, which is one of the things that's required, my personal choice was 50%, so let's use that as our proxy. If you have a 50% savings rate, getting from zero to FI is a journey of somewhere between 10 and 15 years, depending on whether the market winds are at your back or in your face, right? Yep. And that's 10 or 15 years, whether you start at the age of 20 or you start at the age of 60, right? So it's a 10 or 15 year journey to get there. Doesn't matter when you start. That's the length of the journey. That's point number one. Point number two is my favorite quote, maybe of all time, which is in the original version of the book, and in the new version, the very first quote in the book is from a guy named Leo Burnett, who was a ad agency executive back in the 60s and 70s. Leo Burnett, a big Chicago agency. And the quote is, "If you reach for a star, you might not get one, but you won't come up with a handful of mud either."
That's so true. That's so true. And that's a great way for our late starters to look at this, right?
Absolutely. Because let's suppose you start and you say, I want to accumulate $1 million. And you don't quite have enough time, or for whatever reason, you only accumulate $500,000. And you didn't quite get that star, but you still have $500,000. You are still much better off. And what I try to get people to understand is this is not a light switch. This is a journey. It's like going to the gym. The first day you go to the gym, you're not going to bench press 300 pounds. But you're going to be a little stronger than you were the day before, and a little bit stronger, a little bit stronger. The first dollar you save and invest, you're a little bit stronger. And then day by day, when I was using my FU money back in the day to step away from corporate jobs, I was not financially independent by any stretch. But I was a lot stronger than people who didn't have anything saved and invested.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that way too, because I may be 80, 90% of the way on the journey, but say I couldn't work tomorrow, I'd be fine because I've been following this path and I'm looking forward to that day. But right now, it's okay. My wife's working, I'm working, we're enjoying our lives, but were it to stop tomorrow with your path, we'd be fine. And we've followed it now for 8, 10 years and, we're close. And we want our audience to understand that what you've just said, it's 10 to 15 years. If you play your cards just like J.L. Collins asked you to play them, you will not only be healthier financially, you'll probably be healthier physically and mentally because you're sleeping better at night.
I've had a lot of conversations with people over the years, especially at Chautauquas, which were these annual events I used to do. And one of the questions that I would get on a pretty regular basis is someone who would say, I'm in this soul-crushing job. I mean, it's killing me. And I've got $1 million, which if we look at the 4% guideline, can reliably throw off 40,000 to live on, but I need 50,000 to live on. And getting that $1 million up to where it needs to be to throw off that 50,000 and I just don't know if I can do it. And my response to that is always, I would quit yesterday. I'm in a soul crushing job, and I can leave it with my $1 million, and now I've got to draw 5% instead of 4%. Well, if you look at the Trinity study, which looked at a lot of different withdrawal rates, 5% withdrawal has an 86% success rate. 86%. I'm in a soul crushing job. I'm going to take those odds. And the other thing I will say to these people is, imagine that you really don't want to pull that 5%. You just want to be more conservative. Do you think there is something you could figure out how to do over the course of the next 12 months that would generate the extra $10,000? And let's be clear, anybody who has successfully put themselves in a position to have $1 million invested over a course of time is a smart, resourceful person. And I've yet to have any of those people say to me, no, I don't think I could do that. Instead, what I see is a little light bulb that goes off. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a walk in the park. Of course I could do that. So you mentioned earlier that Bill Bengen is coming out with a new book and suggesting that instead of 4%, and he was the guy who originated that, by the way, that it could be 4.7% reliably. Well, yeah, that's great news. So and I think I've heard Bengen say that, 6-7% works a very large percentage of the time. So you need to be flexible at whatever rate you retire. If you retire at 4% and you're looking at 30-year retirement, I would never say put that on autopilot, adjust it for inflation every year, which is what the formula calls for, and then forget about it for two reasons. One is there's a 4% only works 96% of the time. So there is a very slight chance that it's not going to work in your particular 30-year period. So, and you certainly don't want to run out of money, so you want to be paying attention for that reason. But here's the much bigger reason. In the vast majority of times, if you're pulling 4% a year, adjusted for inflation every year, at the end of 30 years, your portfolio would have grown to enormous proportions. Let's suppose that you started with $1 million. The odds are at the end of that 30 years, you're going to have $6, $8, $10, $12, $15 million left over. That's the real reason you want to pay attention, because that's the most likely scenario, and presumably you'd rather enjoy spending some of that money on the journey rather than seeing it as a lump sum when you're 30 years older than when you start. So 4% is a great guideline, as is 5%. So yeah, don't stay in a soul-crushing job if you have those kinds of resources.
Well, Jackie, that's actually in jail. That's a great place, because we love to end the show with an upswing of optimism.
Yeah.
We may get pessimistic in the middle, but Simple Path to Wealth is in its own nature inherently an optimistic book. And you're an optimistic person, and we want to infuse this optimism into our audience. Jackie, this has been an awesome conversation today. It's great to have JL back on the show. And we're going to have him back with Bill Bengen next time, right?
Yeah, we need to find out. So where can people get the book? It's pre-order. And when is the official release date? This may air a little bit after, but hopefully it'll be right around the time that it's launched. So the launch date and everything about the book and how we can get it in our hands.
Yeah, so the launch date is May 20th. So if people are listening to this on or after May 20th, it should be, as they say, in bookstores everywhere. Before that, you can go to Amazon and pre-order it. And, my blog is jlcollinsnh.com. If you go there, you'll see links that will take you to the book and let you order it. So it should be, one of the beauties of doing this to a publisher this time is it should be even more widely available than it was before. So even easier to find.
Excellent.
Well, that's awesome. JL, you're talking to us from your refuge cabana today. Unfortunately, your wife's not there with you. Otherwise, we'd bring her on to close the show. But maybe next time we'll have you, your daughter, and your wife, and then bring in Bill Bengen as a special guest star. There's so many things we can do with this. We like bringing people together. We want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for joining us today on Catching Up to FI. We'll see you next week and next month and next year on Catching Up to FI, right?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always fun hanging out with you guys and talking to you, and it's an honor to be here. I appreciate it.
All right. Any final words, Jackie?
No, just that this has been an honor. JL is one of my favorite, and I think you have touched so many people, and you will touch many more with this new book. So thank you for giving us your time today. It meant a lot.
You're very kind.
Take care.
So, Bill, as you know, we cannot do this show without our amazing staff and the people that help us put this on. Our social media maven is Diana Falk, and our editor is Fritz Brizard. We love them, and they keep us going.
Yeah, Jackie, I mean, this show wouldn't have the quality it has without our folks, our peeps. And we'd also like to give you a few calls to action for the show. We love our community, and we hope you love us back. If you would like to support the show and our mission to help late starters, you can do that at Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform that allows you to make a donation. The link is in the show notes and on the website.
Check out the show notes for resources mentioned in today's show. Also, head on over to our website at catchinguptofi.com and check out our vetted resources, partners, and affiliates for discounts and their services, because we love sharing great deals.
Please share the show with others and head on over to our Facebook community to help us grow. If you prefer video, head on over to YouTube and watch the show there. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to FI. We would appreciate it if you could also leave us a 5-star review to help our message reach others.
And while we are financial educators that love to teach, remember that our content is for general education and information purposes only. We are not providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Always do your own research or consult a professional before making important decisions.
So, Jackie, we'll see our audience next time on Catching Up to FI. Cheers.